what I'd like to focus on are what I call the 4 W's of test anxiety. That is, what is test anxiety? Where does it come from? Why is it important? And finally, what can be done about it? So let's start off with number 1. What actually is test anxiety? Well, this is a fairly typical definition of test anxiety. Emotional and physiological responses like panic, feeling dizzy, and a heart beating very fast. And these are accompanied with thoughts dwelling on failure and the consequences of failure, and resulting in what we call cognitive interference, such as a sense of going blank, problems with concentration, problems with memory, and so on. And these responses arise from appraising or judging a test as being highly threatening, and we'll explore a little bit on the next slide what that actually means. But just a couple of points to make about this definition of test anxiety. Many people, this is not unusual, might become anxious for one-off situations, one-off exams, one-off tests, and so on. When we're talking about these responses here, we're talking about people who have an enduring response like this to not just 1 or 2 exams, but typically all tests or exams. So we quite often refer to it as being enduring or a trait-like experience. But this doesn't mean that it's irreversible, though, because interventions have shown that test anxiety is very amenable in relatively light touch and short-term interventions to reducing. And the other point to make about test anxiety is that these aren't people who become anxious in all situations. It's a very, very specific reaction to situations in which somebody's performance is going to be evaluated. And yeah, it's quite a narrow, what we call situation-specific form of anxiety. So on to the point about threat. Why might somebody view a test or an exam as being threatening? And this is because failure or the consequences of failure might be damaging to one's self-esteem. And sometimes these terms are used interchangeably: self-esteem, self-image, self-view, sometimes self-worth as well. And it might be that somebody views themselves as being somebody who's high achieving, or somebody who takes pride in achievement, or they see themselves as an academic person, and therefore failure might threaten this particular view this person has of themselves. But it could also threaten, failure could potentially threaten one's aspirations. And we live in a very in the UK and many other parts of the world, we live in a very test conscious culture. Everybody knows that particular grades and profiles of grades are needed to advance one's educational aspirations, one's career aspirations, and so on and so on. And then finally, another reason why failure might be damaging is because how one feels they might be judged by important others, and it could be family members, it could be siblings, it could be parents, grandparents, cousins, but it could also be one's peers, and it could also be one's teachers. And this social element to it is hugely important for some people. And the essence of test anxiety, therefore, we can say, is like an exaggeration of the threat posed by failure. And therefore, this could apply equally to actual tests as it could to school assessed grades, which are going to be used by many schools at the present time. So let's move on to the signs of test anxiety. So it's got what we call a cognitive element, and this refers to thoughts. For instance, thoughts about being overwhelmed, not in control, focusing on failure. But the cognitive element has also got this interference side, which we just mentioned a moment ago. And a very common experience of many highly test anxious students is they get into an exam and they might have spent an awful lot of time preparing and learning, revising for that exam, and as soon as they get in there, they just go blank. They freeze up, they feel like they can't remember anything. And sometimes that experience can pass within 5 or 10 minutes, but But obviously in a time-pressured circumstance, those 5 to 10 minutes can be very precious. But test anxiety can also interfere with concentration and attention too. Test anxiety has an emotional or affective component, so feelings of panic, feelings of fear, feelings of anxiety, and this might manifest as feeling faint, feeling like one's heart is beating so fast it's going to explode. It's got a physiological element to it, which is similar to the emotional aspect. You know, these deep physical feelings associated with panic and anxiety. And it's also got a motivational element to it as well. And this can manifest in many different ways. So one of the ways students manage their fears about failure is to what we call disengage from their studies, or make what's called a strategic withdrawal of effort. And these are all avoidance-based forms of motivation. And I'm not suggesting that that every reason a student might disengage with their studies or make less effort than they could is due to test anxiety. But what's important is that because these things can result from test anxiety, we don't discount these as potential manifestations of test anxiety. So that was part number one. What is test anxiety? What I'd like to move on to consider now is where test anxiety comes from. So what we've just looked at in part number one was a definition of test anxiety. What is test anxiety? What I'd like to consider now in part number two is where test anxiety comes from, what the sources of test anxiety are. And I'd like to use, in order to explain this, something called the self-referent executive function model, which is a bit of a mouthful and quite often just referred to as the SREF model. So this SREF model was originally developed as a model for clinical anxiety disorders such as social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and it's very popular among clinicians for guiding anxiety interventions. And this particular version of the SREF model that is used to explain test anxiety was adapted by Moshe Zeidner and Gerald Matthews. And it's a highly detailed model, and I'll try and explain the different elements of it in a step-by-step fashion. But it focuses on the way that a student consciously regulates their emotion, cognition, and behaviour. And some of these regulation strategies that students used function to exaggerate anxiety, that is, to make the threat seem greater than it actually is, and some of them function to maintain anxiety. And in the SREF model, in addition to self-regulation strategies, there's also two other components, which are self-knowledge beliefs and situational interactions. And these two elements, self-knowledge beliefs and situational interactions, they interact with executive function to produce anxiety, distress, and cognitive interference. Okay, so on to the SREF model. So the model begins with a situational threat. And this could be externally triggered, such as being, for instance, notified about the date of a forthcoming test, or being reminded to revise for a forthcoming test. But threats can also be internally triggered as well, such as a student remembering about a forthcoming exam or remembering that they have to revise. And situational threats could apply equally to SAGs, school assessed grades, as to actual tests. And what these situational threats do, as indicated in the diagram here, is that they intrude into conscious thinking and they prompt a number of these executive processes. And the first of these is the appraisal of a forthcoming exam or test or SAG. And the student makes a judgment over how important the grade is. You know, whether that subject is useful and important, what the anticipated difficulty of obtaining a particular grade will be, and so on. And test anxiety is going to be higher when a subject is judged to be useful or important, and when the anticipated difficulty is high. And we've also got an assessment of The stakes of the subject, that is, would success or failure on an exam be particularly important for a student? Is a particular grade needed for educational progression or entry onto a college or university course or some other kind of training? And exam anxiety is higher when the stakes of the exam are perceived to be high. We've also got ineffective approaches to coping or ineffective forms of coping. And what we mean by ineffective forms of coping is that they function to inadvertently exaggerate the anxiety that is experienced. So, for instance, some forms of coping are effective, and these are usually called problem-focused approaches, and they can include planning, doing revision, subsequently doing the revision, asking for help, if there's something that's not understood, and seeking emotional support when it's required, reminding oneself that effort is worthwhile, resolving oneself to try harder in the future, and so on. But ineffective forms of coping include thinking about forthcoming exam, avoiding thinking about a forthcoming exam, trying to prevent others from knowing that there's an exam coming up and how one feels about it, thinking that nothing that you can do will change the outcome, ruminating about worries about the outcome, blaming others for failure, and so on and so on. And these are all called avoidant forms of coping, which, as it suggests, is to avoid thinking about the threat. But we've also got something called emotion-focused coping, which is when somebody becomes preoccupied with the anxiety rather than trying to reduce the threat situation. So these forms of coping are not very effective in that they inadvertently increase anxiety, and they also minimise chances of exam success. And the last executive process we've got in here is called metacognition, and this refers to how we go about monitoring our internal emotional and cognitive state. And for instance, how we try to intensify or suppress certain thoughts. And what we find is that exam anxious people tend to monitor their thoughts very closely and intensify anxiety with beliefs, for instance, that actually worrying is a good way to cope, which it isn't, and that worries are out of control. One can't control one's worry. So to summarise, executive processes that contribute to high levels of exam anxiety are a judgment that an exam is useful and important, but the consequences of success or failure are high, coping through avoidance, thinking about an exam, or focusing on reducing the anxiety rather than focusing on the issue, which is actually trying to prepare well, and a metacognitive style that monitors beliefs closely, combined with beliefs that worry can be actually helpful and spiral out of control. Okay, so that's part one of the model. So to summarise, the executive processes that contribute to high exam anxiety are a judgment that an exam is important or useful, that the consequences of success or failure are high, that the student copes through avoiding thinking about an exam or focusing on reducing the anxiety rather than focusing on the issue, which is actually preparing for that forthcoming exam, and a metacognitive style that monitors beliefs closely, combined with beliefs that worry can actually be helpful and that they might spiral out of control. Okay, so the next part of the model concerns the beliefs which somebody holds about themselves, their self-knowledge beliefs. And executive processes access negative beliefs about one's competence, one's academic competence. For instance, students might believe they're less competent than their classmates or their family members, or maybe that they're not very good at demonstrating knowledge and skills in exam settings. Students might believe they possess poor study skills as well. And executive processes also access the future plans a student had for dealing with this forthcoming exam. And students who appraised an exam as high stakes, important, useful and difficult, combined with the belief that one's not very competent, might need to change and modify these plans. This decision-making process and planning is attentionally demanding, and that itself might distract from other activities and lead to a decision to scrutinise one's thoughts and emotions about the exam more closely. And this can then feed back into executive processes, triggering unhelpful forms of coping, such as avoidance and emotion focus. And then additionally, exam anxious students often hold motives rooted in failure or fear of failure. For instance, students might be motivated not to appear as incompetent, not to gain lower grades than peers, classmates or family members, not to achieve lower than they have done previously or lower than a target grade. And these avoidant motivations can also help to trigger unhelpful forms of coping. And there's a flow of information going back and forth between executive processes and self-knowledge beliefs, and this sets up what's called a self-regulating feedback loop. So, for instance, a student might view an exam as important and difficult, but perceive themselves to have low competence. They want to avoid being seen as a failure, and so become preoccupied with worrisome thoughts and feelings about the forthcoming exam. And without intervention or change, the student becomes then locked into that cycle. So to summarise, the important self-knowledge beliefs for highly test-anxious students are those that are negative. And then we've got plans that focus on grade-related worries and emotions and avoidant motivations, for instance, being motivated to avoid being seen as a failure by others or oneself. The third part of the model is the interaction with the situation, so the learning situation, for instance, at school. And as a result of being preoccupied with failure, the student finds it difficult to stop thinking about the exam and the potential negative consequences, and becomes particularly vigilant and sensitive to things that might indicate failure or judgments about one's competence. And this is what psychologists call attention bias. It means that the person is very sensitive to threat-related information, and they can process that information more easily and rapidly than non-threat related information, and it can happen without any conscious awareness. And hence it's called unconscious bias. It's a form of unconscious bias. And following on from unhelpful coping approaches, the student can become disengaged, they can withdraw effort in exam preparation, and this may provide a reason that protects one's sense of self-worth against being seen as incompetent. You know, I made no effort, hence I failed. But of course, if a student does withdraw effort and engagement, that paradoxically increases the likelihood of failure, you know, because they've missed opportunities to try and improve themselves, practice exam questions, revise, and so on. And a common form of avoidance-based self-sabotage, we call this, is procrastination. For instance, a student putting off starting revision or doing work until the last minute, and that's a result of ineffective coping approaches focusing on worries and emotions rather than the action one needs to take to maximise one's chances of success. So the interaction with the situation provides short-term feedback for executive processes, such as maintaining and reinforcing the likelihood of failure, but it also has long-term feedback as well into self-knowledge beliefs. For instance, it could reinforce the belief that one is not very competent. So what we've got here are two more self-regulating feedback loops. And again, without change or intervention, the person becomes trapped in this cycle of fear of failure. And out of the fear of failure, not engaging in those behaviours that are going to undo it and increase one's chances of success. And then finally, without any change, the next time a test or exam comes along, the person is more likely to view it as a threat again in the future. So the whole cycle begins all over again. So to summarise the main point about interactions with the learning situation, the person becomes very sensitised or biased towards information that indicates failure. They might withdraw and disengage from their studies, maybe as a form of self-worth protection, and that can manifest through procrastination and self-sabotage. Okay, the very final part of the model, the outcome of all of these processes, is an increase in worry, distress, and cognitive interference. And also, when an anxious person becomes aware that they're becoming anxious, that will then feed back into executive processes to monitor one's internal states even more closely, and then to engage in regulatory strategies to try and suppress or down-regulate that anxiety to a manageable level. And unfortunately, that usually means more forms of avoidance and emotion-focused coping. You know, it can be effective in, in the short term, but certainly not as a long-term strategy. So that's the complete SRF model. It's a very comprehensive model. It's a complex model, and I hope I haven't bamboozled you by going into all of this detail. But what it does do, and this is why it's helpful, is that it identifies multiple points for intervention. Multiple points where we can start to undo and break these cycles of self-regulated feedback. And for instance, these could be metacognition, it could be self-knowledge beliefs, it could be exam planning, it could be coping, and it could also be study behaviours. So these are the main points in the model. This is what we know about highly exam anxious students. They hold negative beliefs about themselves, they use ineffective coping approaches, and they tend to procrastinate and withdraw effort. Okay, so on to the next part. Why is test anxiety important? Well, I'm going to cover two reasons. And the first is, as we've already mentioned, test anxiety interferes with information processing. So to a greater or lesser extent, these are the skills that are required in different forms of assessment in order to do well. And anxiety inhibits creativity. It reduces speed of processing, so somebody who's highly anxious takes a little bit longer to do the same or achieve the same level of performance as somebody who's low in anxiety. It interferes with memory, it makes it very difficult to recall facts. It interferes with attention, in that it makes it difficult to keep one's attention focused on the task at hand, for instance, answering an exam question, because their attention keeps coming back onto their self-focused worries. It also reduces one's attentional focus, and that can be very helpful when, for instance, if you think of some threat situations, you're trying to move out of the way of a moving car or a moving bus very quickly. It's very good to have a very narrow attentional focus. But sometimes in an exam setting, you need to be able to think through what different scenarios might be, or you need to be able to access different sorts of information, and a narrow attentional focus doesn't help. And it also reduces cognitive flexibility, that is, the ability to think things through in different ways. Now, I'd just like to show you a graph here of the relationship between test anxiety and achievement, and these are from a study I did quite a while ago now. It's published in 2008, and these are students from 6 schools in the northwest of England. And we have GCSE score plotted on the y-axis, and these were letter grades as used to be used, A star, A, B, and so on, and an A star was given 8 points, a grade A was given 7 points, a grade B was given 6 points, and so on. And sorry, that was on the y-axis, and test anxiety is represented on the x-axis. And I think probably the first point to make here is when you just look at this, it just looks like a big mess. There's an awful lot of noise in the data. But when we actually plot a line of best fit through it and confidence intervals around it, actually the majority of scores go in a sort of oval-shaped fashion that starts at the top left and goes down to the bottom right. And what this tells us is that people who are highly anxious tend to perform much worse, and people who are low anxious tend to perform much better. Now, as used to be the case in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, a grade C used to be a pass grade, which according to the y-axis scale I've used here is 5. And so what we find is that the majority of highly test anxious people were more likely to fail, and the majority of low test anxious people were more likely to pass. And actually the difference, sorry, when I'm saying GCSE scores here, this is a combined aggregated GCSE score, average GCSE score for maths, English and science. And the overall difference between the highest anxious students and the lowest anxious students on those three GCSE grades was 3 GCSE subjects, sorry, was 2 grades per subject. Okay, so the difference between high and low anxious students in this study was 2 grades for maths, 2 grades for English, and 2 grades for science. And that's an awful lot of difference, I think. It could potentially be the difference between 3 passes in key GCSE subjects and 3 fails in 3 key GCSE subjects. Now, meta-analyses, which combine findings from lots of studies, have replicated this kind of finding. And I've just cited one here, for instance, from 2018. And they typically find these negative correlations between exam performance, test performance, and anxiety. But a reasonable question to ask is this just because students who are lower achieving in the first place just tend to become more anxious? So actually, it's not that the anxiety is resulting in worse performance, rather it's children, low ability children, adolescents, or low achieving children and adolescents who become more anxious. And I haven't cited them all here because it will take up too much time and too much space, but there are several studies which statistically control for prior achievement. And what they've shown is that even when you do account for prior achievement or prior cognitive ability, that we still find anxiety, high levels of anxiety predict lower achievement. And that tells us that it's simply not the case that lower achieving students are those who are more anxious. It is those students who are more anxious who perform worse, and that is such a critical finding. Now, the other reason why test anxiety is important is because it can be detrimental to well-being and good mental health. Now, this is a study from the United States, a sample of children and adolescents aged 5 to 10 years. And what we've got are the children's symptoms on generalized anxiety disorder, which is abbreviated to GAD, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, separation anxiety disorder, and depression. And this study compared high with low test anxious students on all of the symptoms of these different anxiety disorders. And we can see that highly test anxious students reported higher symptoms of generalized anxiety, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, separation anxiety disorder, and depression. And there are cut points on these particular scales, and these are thresholds at which the person is likely to receive a diagnosis for that disorder. And overall, we can see that only test anxious persons meet the diagnostic threshold for separation anxiety disorder. I mean, fortunately, everyone's under the thresholds for the other disorders. But nonetheless, we can see that the highly test anxious persons were more likely to be closer to this threshold. And actually, there are several other studies which show that actually many highly test anxious students do meet these thresholds. And many highly test anxious students do become diagnosed with generalized anxiety, social anxiety disorder, and so on. And the final point I'd like to make about well-being, and this is a very sobering finding, actually. And it comes from a study which was a review of coroners' reports of adolescent suicides. And it was adolescent suicides in England, and they collected data over a 16-month period, examined coroners' reports over a 16-month period, 2014 to 15. And in those coroners' reports, specifically academic pressures were cited as the cause of suicide in 27% of cases, and specifically exam pressures in 15% of cases. And so this really underscores the importance of taking test anxiety seriously. It's not something that we should trivialize, and it's not something, as I've heard some people say, that it's the case that exams are supposed to be stressful. I'm not actually sure exams are supposed to be stressful, but even if they were supposed to be stressful, it's missing the point that there are huge individual differences here in how people respond to that stress or pressure. And some people might respond to that stress or pressure very well, and it becomes motivating for them, and they see the exam as a challenge, and it actually helps them with their performance, but that is not the same for everybody. For some people, that pressure becomes debilitating, and for those people, we definitely should not trivialize. Okay, so I'm on to the final point of my presentation here, and that is what can be done about test anxiety. And the way I like to approach intervention for test anxiety is to think about this model here, which is a model which underpins cognitive behavioural intervention. And that is that behaviours, thoughts and emotions all interact with one another. So behaviours influence thoughts and emotions. Thoughts influence behaviours and emotions influence thoughts and behaviours. So what this means is that if we change any one of these three, it's going to have an impact on the other. So if we change how we think, it will change how we behave and feel. If we change how we feel, it will change how we think and behave. And if we change how we behave, it will change how we think and feel. And so what that means is that we can intervene with highly test anxious students in terms of behaviours, and that's principally through helping them understand effective ways to revise. We can intervene with their emotions, and that is principally through teaching students relaxation strategies. And we can intervene with students' thinking, which is teaching them how to identify and challenge thoughts which exaggerate or maximize anxiety. So relaxation strategies are one of the easiest things that can be done. And I'm sure many people, if they have ever been to a yoga class or something like that, have done something very, very similar to this. And one method is called progressive muscle relaxation. And what happens in progressive muscle relaxation is that you generally lie down, although you can sit up, you don't have to be lying down, and you gradually work through your body. So for instance, like the schedule goes here, forehead, eyes, cheeks, mouth, shoulders, arms, and so on. And you imagine tensing up or scrunching up the muscles in that part of the body as tight as you can, and then you hold them to 5, and then you let go and relax. So you do that with the forehead. So you start off scrunching up your forehead really, really, really tightly, count to 5, and then relax, let go. And then, you work through all of the body, and then you get to the end, and then you tense up the whole body, everything, toes, feet, lower back, legs, shoulders, arms, hold it for 5, and then let go. And that progression of becoming tense and letting go, becoming tense and letting go, is teaching people how to identify or learn to identify the feeling of when they're becoming anxious and or tense in their muscles, and then let go of that tension, which can help to relax them. Something else that people have possibly done in yoga classes, and this can be done in quite complex ways in yoga classes, but it doesn't have to be complex, is something called deep breathing or diaphragmatic breathing. So breathing from the diaphragm. And the most simple way to do this is to place one hand over the chest and another hand around the diaphragm area, and just to close your eyes, and then imagine breathing in, and it's going past the hand on your chest, and it's going all the way down to the hand on your diaphragm, and then use that bottom hand on your diaphragm to feel your diaphragm expanding, and then maybe hold your breath, not so it's uncomfortable, for just 1, 2, 3 or 5, 3 or 5, and then allow it to release again slowly. And it's very simple. There's multiple videos on YouTube showing you how to do this if you want to have a look at them. And you can teach your students to do this. And for something that's so simple to learn, I found students really like this. And they really like it generally because it's quite quick. It's an antidote to the physiological activation that goes with anxiety. It's an antidote to that works very, very quickly. It can calm people down very, very quickly. So it's something to use when people become panicked, because it will have very quick effects. But importantly, it gives people that sense that they're in control, that actually I can do something about this, and it starts to build confidence that actually anxiety isn't necessarily something I need to worry about because I can change it, I can do something about it. And that's how we're starting to see the effect of, if we work on relaxation strategies, we change how people feel, and it starts to change how people think. Okay, so they're quick win strategies. A slightly more medium-term strategy is to teach students how to approach their revision or exam preparation in what we call a cycle of self-regulated learning. And the actual idea is quite simple. Set revision goals. I need to revise this, or I need to prepare this for an exam. Then the person actually does the revision, but then they then evaluate whether that revision was effective or not. And then they use that judgment of whether the revision was effective or not to set new goals. And in my experience, students are very, very good at number one. They're very good at making these sometimes very ornate and elaborate revision timetables of what they need to do and what they need to learn. But 2 and 3 start getting a bit hit and miss. Students quite often do their revision, but in my experience, students aren't necessarily very aware of different ways of revising. And so they're not aware of whether the approach they're using is the right approach for that particular subject, whether they should be using a different approach, and in fact what those other approaches might actually look like. So I think a bit of time needs to be spent showing students different ways of revising, different ways of preparing for their exam. And naturally some students will gravitate more towards some styles than others, and that's fine. And some students will find some styles more effective than others, and actually some styles are more effective for some subjects than others, and that's okay. That's okay. But generally, students, I find, don't tend to evaluate whether their revision is being effective or not. And how does a student evaluate whether their revision is effective or not? By testing themselves. And that might just be repeating back what they know to themselves. It might be telling everything they know to somebody else. It might be writing that down. It might be trying a practice exam question. There's loads of ways in which they can test that effectiveness of their revision. But the student has got to give themselves some feedback. And if their revision wasn't effective, then that's where their setting new goals becomes critical, because they either need to try a different method of revision or they need to do the revision again. But what's really important is that the student does not continue with an ineffective approach. If their revision was effective, then they can carry on and revise a different topic. If it wasn't effective, as I've said, they need to revise it again or try a different approach. That's the basic framework of self-regulated learning, and there's much more to it than that, because goals have got to be realistic, achievable. They can't be too big. There's lots of importance of breaking things down into small goals and just revising small chunks at a time. And of course, once a subject has been revised, it can't just be left, it's got to be re-revised. And in fact, re-revising is a very powerful method of consolidating memory, and in fact retesting is a very powerful method for consolidating memory as well. But I think this idea, this is not the domain of psychologists. This is something that many teachers will be very comfortable doing and working with their students with. And what we're starting to do here in terms of the SREF model is break down that maladaptive interaction with the situation. We're teaching students how to get a sense of control over their future exams, so that even if an exam is seen as important and it's seen as difficult, the student is learning here, well, actually, I know that I can achieve those outcomes that I want to. And that will then start to feed back into their self-competence beliefs and their beliefs about themselves, that this is something that can be changed. It'll start to change their coping approaches, it'll start to reduce their avoidant motivations, and so on and so on. So, by changing behavior here, it will then start to change how people think. Here are, for instance, many different ways of revising with words that you could show to students, and revising with sounds, so using mnemonics, identifying keywords, students making up little rhymes and songs, podcasts. Visual ways to revise, like making posters, mind maps, graphs, flowcharts, and so on. There's loads of different ways. and also summary approaches, which probably most important for very sort of text-heavy exams. And it might be organising notes, highlighting key points, making summaries, making flashcards, and so on. And it's really important that these different methods, students are aware of these different methods of revising, and students are exposed to, and maybe guided through some practice of making these different approaches. Okay, so the final method of intervention is where we try and target the thoughts that underpin the anxiety. Now, this is a slightly longer strategy, longer term strategy. It's also a bit more complex. It's a bit more hard to do. It requires a bit more persistence on the part of the student. Now, this ABC model here is a classic model used in psychological intervention. A stands for an activating event. B stands for the beliefs about the activating event, and C refers to the consequences, specifically the emotional consequences of those beliefs, and to a lesser extent behavioural consequences. So, for instance, an activating event could be a forthcoming exam or school assessed grade. A belief about that might be, for instance, I think I'm going to fail. And the emotional consequence of that might be anxiety, and the behavioural consequence might be withdrawing effort. Now, what tends to happen is that people are not aware of B. People know they've got a forthcoming exam and they just get anxious. People know they've got a forthcoming exam and they just start withdrawing effort because it's just too threatening for them. So people tend to bypass B and they go straight from A to C. And so what you need to work through are examples like this drawn from students' own experiences that show them excuse me, how their beliefs determine their emotional and behavioural consequences. Students have to understand that A doesn't necessarily lead to C, that A only leads to C because of these particular beliefs. And you can show students how alternate beliefs, for instance, I'll try my hardest, could have alternate emotional consequences, such as feeling hopeful rather than anxious, and alternate behavioural consequences, such as making effort with one's exam preparation rather than not. And it's fine showing some students examples like this, but then the student has got to go away and do it for themselves. And so it can be helpful for students to keep a diary of every time they get anxious, and for them to reflect upon what they were thinking at that time, so they can become aware of these beliefs. And then they need to be shown ways and encouraged ways of challenging those beliefs. Why might that belief, I'm going to fail, have come from? Why is that unrealistic? A student might think, for instance, I can't do anything about it, and that's simply not true. They could do something about it. Or a student might think, well, if I fail this exam, my whole life's going to be a failure. And again, that's simply not true. They're magnifying the threat. So really problematic beliefs are those that lead to exaggerated negative consequences at sea. And this requires a bit of time. This is not an instantaneous solution, but it's also the best long-term strategy. I have a guide for students that includes these intervention approaches that I have described. It's intended for students aged 14 to approximately 18, 19 years, and it's freely available. So if anyone would like one of these guides, and you're free to distribute it to your students, to print it off and give it to them, or to distribute it electronically, there's no copyright issues attached to it, then please send me an email and I will be more than happy to share this with you. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope it was useful.